welcome to the Rock for Reading Concert 2009, Voices for Literacy. And we have here pre-show Allison Moore and Steve Earle, who are both performing tonight. And we wanted to ask them a little about reading. Now, I've met Steve a number of times, and he's always struck me as the sort of fellow who got in trouble in school for reading in class.
I was reading, Stranger in a Strange Land, and I think science fiction was the hook for me. I think there was this, Heinlein did a series of books called Space Cadet that were kids' books. They were aimed at, third and fourth graders, and I was reading a little ahead of my level, and I ran out of titles by that author in the library and ran across this book called Stranger in a Strange Land, written by the same guy, and it has a lot to do with who I am. Reading was, for me, a subversive activity. I wish I'd read some of the stuff they were trying to make me read at the time. I was unfortunate. I had 3 football coaches in a row as English teachers at a very critical point in my life, and it sort of put me off of school. But reading was the one thing that I kept doing, and I thank God for it. It's the only reason I'm even anything close to literate is I developed, a habit of reading voraciously. When I'm not doing anything else, I generally read.
I just remember always reading, and it was sort of an escape for me when I was a kid. My father was an English major and also had an agriculture major, so he was sort of a weird influence. He was a big Steinbeck fan, a big Hemingway fan, so those books were always around the house. But the first, for real book I remember reading was The Pearl, which is Steinbeck. And it was just always something, it used to drive my sister crazy because she wouldn't want to play, and I'd be like, no, I'm fine, reading. So I've always been
recorded your own audiobooks too.
Yes, there is a tape of me reading Peter Rabbit.
No kidding.
Into my tape recorder. Yes, and
that
she bursts
survives.
into the room and she goes, Peter, 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 and then she storms out.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and Peter Rabbit went into the field, and it's pretty funny. So it's always been a way that I survived.
This one, when Tom and I met, that was one of the first things we discovered was we came to the Lord of the Rings through these different paths. We drove Billy Bragg nuts because the second movie came out, the extended version came out, and we went out and bought it. And if you're a Brit commie, it's not cool to be into Tolkien because he beat out George Orwell for the book of the millennium. So they're all anti-Tolkien.
He did get me to read The Hobbit.
I got her through The Hobbit.
Somehow I totally missed it as a child. I was never introduced to that sort of thing because I don't know if it was just, the people around me didn't really get science fiction, but I was not into that at all. And still enjoy reading, more literature things.
I came to those books from being a hippie, from being the youngest among us. I came to it from head shops, and I read The Lord of the Rings for the first time in probably 1971 or something like that. So.
Well, you know what, I don't know if this is a tribute to William Blake and his progression from innocence to experience, but talking to Steve recently, he seems to be experiencing kind of a second childhood, a rebirth of wonder with the books he's choosing, because he told me he was rereading the Harry Potter series from book 1.
It gets worse. I read them, and then I went out and bought them the unabridged audiobooks, and I worked out for the last 6 months listening to them again. I love those books. They're total escapism, but they're also, I think that those books are going to be. There's a lot of stuff that gets dismissed as popular literature that I think, I think there's nothing separates Stephen King from Edgar Allan Poe but 100 Years in a Heartbeat. I really and truly believe that. And, the way that he writes all the time, he can't not write, but his best stuff is as good as anybody's. And I'm somebody that reads a lot more nonfiction than I do fiction. And when I turn to fiction, it is for escape. So I read science fiction, and I read fantasy, but I love the Harry Potter books because it's really, really great storytelling, and it's there's a whole generation of kids that grew up with it. It was originally about trying to relate to some kids that had sort of come into my life, through a girlfriend, and I'm still talking to the kids and not to the girl, and I'm still reading Harry Potter books, and they're all grown up. So.
Love in the Time of Cholera, which is
by
probably
Marquez.
the most well-written book I've ever
That's
read.
a good one.
It's pounding. It just blows my mind. I'll reread. It's taken me a while because I'll just reread passages that just blow my mind. So, how this all relates to songwriting is obviously you need the power of words to do it. And I think if you understand them and understand a little bit how they work well together, you may have a little bit of an easier time, putting your own pen to the paper. The childhood thing is, I only read a few Jane Austen books while I was in high school, so one of my goals now is to go back and reread the ones that I read and then get the ones that I missed. So I got a big Jane Austen reader that's about like that. And I recently read the annotated Pride and Prejudice, which I just loved, because it gives you all the little footnotes about, what was what at the time and how a lady would dress and where a lady would sit and when they would eat dinner and what they would eat and what was in vogue and at the time that she wrote this book, because they were very pop culture books at the time.
Dickens is the same
well,
thing. Dickens
I was going to say,
absolutely, totally pop culture.
You were talking about popular fiction, right, and how people try to dismiss it because it's popular. People forget that Charles Dickens was the most read author of his day.
That's why Stephen, when he started The Green Mile, fascinated me, because that's what he was doing. Was that he had become cognizant of the fact that Dickens was originally, almost everything he ever wrote was published as serials originally, and so he designed The Green Mile to be a serial. He didn't know how it was going to end when he published the first volume, and that blows my mind. I think that's the kind of stuff that keeps reading alive. Back to the Harry Potter thing, I think, I could very easily be a literary snob. I totally have all the credentials, and I read all the stuff, but I go through periods in my life when, and recently I've been sort of, having to take myself down a peg. And I think a lot of it was the experience of taking a little girl to a bookstore at midnight when The Prisoner of Azkaban came out. And it was mind-blowing to see kids lined up around the block to buy a book in the era of video games, in the era of all this other stuff. So we're talking about in the record business. One of the reasons that the record business is falling apart is it's not all about downloading. It's about we're competing with so much stuff, so many ways for people to that people can input into their brains. And people have made a lot of records that sucked, and that contributed to it. So it's not, we just came out of a period when songwriting was a form of literature, and I think we're at a moment of truth where it may not continue to be. Pop music may just be pop music again, and the era I grew up in, I learned to write songs, and that she learned to write songs in, it wasn't that. Songwriting was definitely recognized as an art form, and we that practiced it were generally fairly well-read people.